And we're back once again for another episode of the long-running series, Real Railroads, Episode 5. Ben from comment, there was one, who was Roy Eltham, made the comment to read the rest of the series. This implies that this is not going to last long. On the contrary, this is going to last a long time. At least through to 2022, if not longer. Depends on how much content I can figure out. Filming different industries, and it's much like what DJ's Trains does, only in a different area, and stuff like that. Covering more just talking like a live stream, but we'll get into more subjects. And once the model railroad is done, I'll be covering the real aspect of that, and stuff, including the big layout and different locomotives and stuff, which it'll be easy to do with models, because those you can talk about the locomotive and you can see it and such. Yeah, but this is Real Railroads episode, but those will be later. This is Real Railroads episode 5, Forming the Class 1s of North America, part 3. This will be on the Canadian railroads. Canadian National Railway started as a government railroad when private railroads went bankrupt in 1919. Canadian National Railway was formed in that year out of the consolidation of 3 lines and inherited Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific from Canadian Northern Railway as an American subsidiary. By 1923, CNR had control of U.S. Class I Grand Trunk Western. On November 1st, 1928, it became Grand Trunk Western Railroad Company, with most of its subsidiaries absorbed into it. The Central Vermont Railway was reorganized on January 31st, 1930. Having a turbulent past with many failures, it remained a CN subsidiary for the rest of its existence, but was operated as an independent railroad. Diesels would wear the CN green and yellow, but with a huge CV on the side instead of the name written out for the majority of diesels. There were a few with the CV on with the Central Vermont written out, like Canadian National had in that paint scheme, and then there were some that were a Grand Trunk-like scheme that was black and orange with white lettering, or black and red-orange, whatever, the color that's on the nose of Grand Trunk locomotives. In 1937, U.S. Steel subsidiaries Duluth, Mesabi and Northern and Spirit Lake Transfer Railways merged and absorbed the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad and Interstate Transfer Railway in 1938, creating the Duluth, Mesabi and Iron Range, a new U.S. Steel subsidiary. This was an ore railroad shipping high-grade iron ore from mines in Minnesota to docks near Duluth, where it was loaded into lake freighters and shipped to docks, primarily Conneaut, Ohio, where the iron ore was loaded into U.S. Steel subsidiary, be it Bessemer and Lake Erie trains, and shipped to the Pittsburgh area steel mills, where B&L interchanged with Union Railroad, New York Central, Pennsylvania, and more. B&L also shipped coal north from Pittsburgh to Conneaut, Ohio. In 1963, the high-grade ore was disappearing, and the DM and IR was in danger of closing. Its savior was the invention of taconite, and the first mine dealing in taconite opened in 1964, followed by the first shipment of taconite, which happened April 8, 1966, carried by the Great Lakes Transport-owned freighter SS Edmund Fitzgerald. In 1971, CN formed subsidiary Grand Trunk Corporation and put the Grand Trunk Western Railway Company, Central Vermont Railway, and Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific under it. This was the birth of the blue scheme with red-orange ends and white lettering and accents, which would be applied to DWMP, GTW, and some CV units, but at some point they also did a black scheme with the red-orange ends and white accents and lettering, which I already spoke about earlier. Now, on August 10th, 1972, was a merger. The Illinois Central Railroad and the Gulf Mobile and Ohio Railroad merged to form the Illinois Central Gulf, which will be familiar to a few people. If you follow Redbird Tony, you do. You know that railroad. In June 1980, the GTW acquired another subsidiary, Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton. This was an almost 500-mile railroad that operated from Detroit, Michigan, basically due south to Ironton, Ohio, and had formerly been controlled by PRR from 1929 to 1968, and then Penn Central until 1970. In 1983, it was absorbed into the GTW. On April 3, 1987, the Soo Line, a subsidiary of Canadian Pacific, sold their Lake States Transportation Division, which became Wisconsin Central Limited, and started operating on October 11th that same year. Later on, we'll be covering the original Wisconsin Central, which merged into the Soo Line, but then they spun off other lines. In 1988, United States Steel Corporation partnered with Blackstone Group to form a new holding company, Transtar Incorporated, which was given control of the DM&IR, BNLE, and Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern, all steel-associated railroads under the U.S. Steel umbrella. On February 29, 1988, the ICG had sold off most of the GM&O trackage to 4 new railroads. Therefore, they decided to rebrand as the Illinois Central Railroad again, since the merger had basically been undone. In December 1991, Canadian National came up with a new name for their system, Canadian National North America. GTW and its subsidiaries started operating under that new name temporarily. In 1993, the Wisconsin Central acquired Fox River Valley Railroad, Green Bay and Western, and New Zealand Rail. Wisconsin Central would become a major worldwide name. On February 1, 1995, they bought the Algoma Central Railway, and the same year renamed New Zealand Rail Transrail. They also acquired part of the UK company Rail Express Systems. The next year, WC acquired more UK companies, Loadhaul, Mainline Freight, and Transrail Freight, and merged them to form English, Welsh, and Scottish, which then absorbed Rail Freight Distribution in 1997. Real imaginative name for a railroad. English, Welsh, and Scottish. British are not good at names. On February 11th, 1998, the 3,130.21 mile Illinois Central and its subsidiary Chicago Central were purchased by CN, which had began operating the IC on July 1st, 1999. Also in 1999, the CN attempted to merge with BNSF, but this was denied. At this point, I'm just going to say in the early 2000s, the steel-associated railroads were moved around to various companies because after digging and digging, I was unable to piece together a clear timeline. One source said one thing happened, another said a second thing, and the third source said yet another. But on October 21st, 2001, CN acquired Wisconsin Central Limited as a subsidiary. Then on May 10th, 2004, they acquired Great Lakes Transportation LLC, which owns the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad, Duluth, Mesabi and Iron Range Railway, Great Lakes Fleet Incorporated, and the Pittsburgh and Conneaut Dock Company for $380 million. CN acquired the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern on December 24, 2008, and followed that with a series of mergers of their subsidiaries. On December 21, 2011, the Duluth, Winnipeg and Pacific, and the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range are merged into Wisconsin Central Limited, which were followed on January 1, 2013 by Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern. Another subsidiary of CN is BC Rail. This was known as British Columbia Railway from 1972 to 1984, and in 2004 was leased by CN for 60 years, with various options to extend the lease for a total up to 999 years. Another former subsidiary is the Newfoundland Railway. This came under CN control on March 31, 1949, when Newfoundland became the 10th province of Canada. This was narrow gauge, which required transferring of freight along with ferry service, which proved problematic. Truck gauge, which required truck and bus traffic were much easier than the transload necessary for the railroad. They at one point tried switching trucks, and there was a couple other ideas that they tried, and they failed. Through the 1970s, CN stopped really caring about the railroad, renamed it Terra Transport in 1979. All branch lines closed down in 1984, and the operation was officially abandoned on October 1st, 1988. They just stopped advertising it. They just let the trucks and buses take over. Another sold-off subsidiary was Central Vermont Railway. CN sold this trackage to Railtex on February 3, 1995, which founded the New England Central Railroad. In 2000, Railtex was acquired by Rail America, which was then acquired by Genesee Wyoming in 2012. The NECR remains a large railroad under the GWI corporate umbrella. The final subsidiary sold off was Algoma Central Railway, which was sold to Watco in March 2021. Today, CN still has its subsidiaries Illinois Central, Bessemer and Lake Erie, Wisconsin Central Limited, and Grand Trunk Corporation. GT has been considered a non-operating Class 1 railroad by the AAR since 2002, but is owned and operated by Canadian National. CN still has a few locomotives in the paint of their subsidiaries, GTW being the most easily spotted with over 40 GP38-2s still in the blue with red, orange ends and white lettering. Also, locomotives remain painted in the Illinois Central Death Star paint. Bessemer and Lake Erie has a handful in their orange and black, and supposedly there remain some locomotives in WC, EJ&E, and DM&IR paint, though I haven't found any recent photos of any. And of course, there are the BC Rail locomotives, which are the red, white, and blue C40-8Ms and blue and white -9s. At this time, the Surface Transportation Board is considering the offer CN made to purchase Canadian Pacific. While CN and KCS work closely together, I don't think this will go through. I think the STB really feels the KCS needs to stay independent, even given its operating area, but we will see. As after this script was written, the STB has denied CN permission to put the KCS in trust, pretty much killing the merger deal. Now the other Canadian railroad. 12,500-mile Canadian Pacific Railway's first acquisition was in 1888 when it gained control of the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic. Its second was in 1891 when it leased the New Brunswick Railway for 991 years. This was followed by the 1895 joint acquisition of Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo, with CP owning 27% and New York Central owning 73%. Meanwhile, the Delaware and Hudson was forming and buying railroads, building a system in northern New York, New England, and Quebec. In 1912, Canadian Pacific acquired 3 more railroads, the Dominion Atlantic on January 3rd, the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway on July 1st, those are annoying names, and the Quebec Central Railway on December 14th. On January 1st, 1961, Canadian Pacific merged with Duluth South Shore and Atlantic. They merged Duluth South Shore and Atlantic, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Sault Ste. Marie Railroad and Wisconsin Central Railway to form the Soo Line Railroad. In 1964, the Wisconsin Central was the original Wisconsin Central, not the one that became CN. In 1964, the Norfolk and Western gained control of the Delaware and Hudson and Erie-Lackawanna. In 1975, the Erie-Lackawanna decided to be part of Conrail and left Norfolk and Western with only the D&H. The April 1st, 1976 merger to form Conrail resulted in the D&H being given trackage rights over a large portion of Conrail to maintain competition in the Northeast, effectively doubling the D&H system. In 1977, Canadian Pacific purchased 63% of Conrail's interest in the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo, leaving Conrail a 10% interest and keeping the TH&B out of Conrail. In 1980, the Norfolk and Western gave D&H financial support, but basically tells it to sink or swim. In June 1982, CP subsidiary Soo Line acquired the Minneapolis, Northfield, and Southern Railway. 2 things happened in 1984. The D&H was purchased by Guilford Transportation Industries for $500,000 to create a large regional railroad serving all of the Northeast, and Soo Line Corporation is formed, with CP a 56% owner to control the Soo Line Railroad. On February 19, 1985, the Soo Line acquired the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad and reorganized it to be controlled by a company named the Milwaukee Road Incorporated. On January 1st, 1986, both Milwaukee Road and the Minneapolis, Northfield, and Southern were merged into Soo Line. On February 10th, the Soo Line formed the Lake States Transportation Division to operate less important lines. On September 5th of the same year, the Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern is formed from spin-off Chicago Northwestern Transportation Company trackage. On January 1st, 1987, the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo was merged into Canadian Pacific. The same year, Soo Line sold the 2,000-mile Lake States Transportation Division off the regional railroad Wisconsin Central Limited. In 1988, Guilford abandoned the D&H operation, which the federal government then ordered New York Susquehanna and Western to operate under subsidy until a buyer is found. In 1990, the Soo Line falls under CP's complete control. In 1991, the Canadian Pacific purchased the Delaware and Hudson. Then in 1994, after only 103 years of lease, they abandoned the New Brunswick Railway. And in 1996, formed subsidiary St. Lawrence and Hudson to take over all lines that were not profitable. In 2000, the STL&H and Soo Line were consolidated into the Canadian Pacific. Soo Line remains a subsidiary in ownership of U.S. operations, but operated by the Canadian Pacific. In 2002, the Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern purchased I&M Rail Link and renamed it to Iowa, Chicago, and Eastern. On September 30th, 2008, with the intention of entering the Powder River Basin in Wyoming, Canadian Pacific acquired the Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern, there's a train, and its subsidiary, Iowa, Chicago, and Eastern. On May 30th, 2014, after having pretty much given up on the Powder River Basin, CP sold the DM&E trackage and several DME and ICE locomotives to G&W Property, Rapid City, Pierre, and Eastern for $210 million. Looks like the local's in town, so we'll pause there. On September 19th, 2015, Norfolk Southern purchased the southern portion of the Delaware and Hudson tracks from Schenectady to Sunbury, PA, which they had been the primary railroad operating on it for a few years. On June 4th, 2020, the CP bought the Central Maine and Quebec Railway, which had rebuilt the MM&A from the Lac-Mégantic disaster and become profitable again. On March 21st, 2021, they offered $29 billion for Kansas City Southern and its holdings, but on May 21st were outbid by Canadian National. CP has made another offer, but is not being considered by KCS anymore. This concludes episode 5. Next episode will be episode 6, of course. This will be on the Genesee, Wyoming beginnings.